Everyone in the bank saw it happening. No one said a word. Then one man stepped forward. It was supposed to be a quick errand. Nothing complicated. Mrs. Evelyn Daniels stepped out of the morning sun and into the cool air of Crescent Bank and Trust in Birmingham, Alabama. She adjusted her purse on her arm, clutching a small stack of papers, her account information, ID, and withdrawal slip. The bank had been her go-to for over 3 decades. Every first Monday of the month, like clockwork, she came in, withdrew enough cash for her bills and essentials, and exchanged pleasantries with whoever was behind the counter. Today should have been no different. The bank lobby had the usual quiet murmur of voices, the soft beeps of card readers, the occasional shuffle of feet. A row of tellers worked behind the counter, a few customers waited in line, and an older man in a navy suit sat in the corner filling out a deposit slip. It was a regular Monday morning, until it wasn't. Evelyn moved forward in line, her heels making a gentle tapping sound against the polished floor. Her mind wandered as she waited. She thought about how her grandson had promised to come by and fix that wobbly shelf in her kitchen, about how the heat outside was already unbearable and it wasn't even noon, about whether she had enough eggs at home to make cornbread later. Then it was her turn. She stepped up to the counter, offering a warm smile to the young teller. He barely glanced up. His name tag read, Brandon. He looked no older than 25, with tired eyes and the kind of impatience that made it clear he didn't want to be here. "Good morning, young man," Evelyn greeted, sliding her withdrawal slip and ID toward him. "I'd like to take out $800 from my account, please." Brandon took the papers, but instead of the usual routine, typing into the computer, verifying the account, handing her the cash, he frowned. He studied her ID a little too long, flipping it back and forth like something wasn't adding up. "This is a large withdrawal," he muttered. "I need to check something." Evelyn's smile wavered. Large? $800 wasn't large. Not for someone who had been banking here longer than Brandon had been alive. But she stayed patient. "Of course, dear. Take your time," she said, folding her hands over her purse. Brandon typed something into his computer, his eyes narrowing at the screen. Then, without looking at her, he spoke again. "I'll need further verification before I can process this." Evelyn blinked. "Excuse me?" "You'll need to show another form of ID," Brandon said flatly. Evelyn frowned. This had never happened before. Not once in 30 years of coming here. "I have my driver's license right there," she said, pointing to the card on the counter. Brandon exhaled sharply, like she was being difficult. "Yes, but we need additional identification for withdrawals over a certain amount." A pause. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, something subtle but unmistakable. "Since when?" she asked. Brandon didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned to another teller, muttered something, then returned his gaze to the screen, ignoring her question entirely. Evelyn glanced behind her. The line had grown. A few people were watching now, some subtly, others openly. She could feel the heat rising, but not from the Alabama sun this time. She took a breath, keeping her voice steady. "Young man, I've been banking here since before you were born. I've never had to show extra ID before. What exactly is the issue?" Brandon's lips pressed into a thin line. "I need to call a manager," he said shortly. Then, without waiting for her response, he stood and walked away. Something about this didn't feel right. But it was just the beginning. Evelyn exhaled slowly, resisting the urge to glance around. She could feel eyes on her, watching, judging. The air inside the bank suddenly felt thicker, heavier, like the temperature had shifted by a few degrees. She glanced at the counter where Brandon had left her ID sitting. Her name, her picture, the same information she had used here for decades. But somehow, today, it wasn't enough. A few feet away, Brandon stood next to a woman in a stiff grey blazer. The bank manager. They spoke in hushed voices, but Evelyn caught the quick glances thrown in her direction. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. She thought about the last time she'd seen something like this. Not to her, but to a friend of hers, Miss Lorraine, who had gone to buy a refrigerator last summer. The salesman had all but ignored her, waiting on other customers first, questioning if she could afford it when she finally got his attention. She had left humiliated, driving across town just to spend her money somewhere else. Evelyn had shaken her head at the time, thinking, that wouldn't happen to me. And yet, here she was. Brandon returned first, walking back to his station without meeting her eyes. The manager followed a few seconds later, standing tall with her arms crossed, looking down at Evelyn like she had just been pulled from something far more important. "Ma'am," the woman started, voice clipped and professional, "we have to be cautious about fraudulent activity. Do you have another form of identification?" Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Fraudulent activity?" "Yes," the manager said, already sounding exasperated, like explaining it was an inconvenience. "We have policies in place to prevent unauthorized withdrawals, and with an amount like this, we just need to confirm." "An amount like what?" Evelyn cut in, keeping her tone even. $800? That's a problem now." The manager blinked, caught off guard for a split second, then recovered. "It's a security measure," she said smoothly, "for your protection." Evelyn let the words hang between them for a moment. For your protection. The phrase was supposed to sound reassuring, but something about it felt like an excuse. A flimsy cover for whatever was actually happening here. She thought about all the times she had walked into this bank, chatted with tellers, smiled at managers, and never, not once, been made to feel like she didn't belong. Until today. Evelyn sighed and reached into her purse, pulling out a small card. "Here," she said, handing over her Medicare ID. "Will this be enough?" The manager took it, barely glancing at it before shaking her head. "We need a secondary government-issued ID." Evelyn's patience thinned. "My driver's license is sitting right there," she said. "It has my name, my picture, my address, and the signature I have used on every transaction in this building for 30 years. The manager didn't flinch. "I understand, ma'am, but it's policy," she repeated, her tone the same one used to talk down to children or people who were hard of hearing. Evelyn's jaw tightened. "If it's policy, then tell me this." She gestured toward the next customer in line, a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt and khakis. "Did you ask him for 2 forms of ID before he made his transaction?" The manager stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. The man in khakis looked up from his phone, startled by the sudden attention. He hadn't been asked for extra identification. Everyone in the bank knew it. And yet, no one said a word. Evelyn's heart thumped harder in her chest. She had spent a lifetime recognizing moments like these, the kind where you could either swallow it down and move on, or push back and risk making a scene. She didn't like making scenes. She never had. But something about this moment made her refuse to shrink. She straightened her shoulders, looking the manager directly in the eye. "I would like to speak to someone else," she said. The manager gave a tight-lipped smile. "I am the supervisor." Evelyn held her gaze. "Then get me someone above you." The manager hesitated, eyes flickering toward Brandon, who suddenly looked deeply interested in his keyboard. For a long moment nobody spoke. The room felt too quiet. Then a voice broke the silence. "Is there a problem here?" Deep, steady, commanding. Every head turned toward the entrance. And that's when everything changed. The voice came from near the entrance. A man standing tall in a crisp navy blue suit. His presence alone seemed to shift the air in the room. The bank manager turned slightly, schooling her face into something polite but wary. Evelyn, however, recognized him immediately. Charles Bennett. He wasn't just another customer. He was a well-known businessman, a former city councilman, and someone deeply respected in the community. His influence stretched beyond the walls of this bank, beyond this neighborhood, and he knew it. Evelyn had seen him on the news, shaking hands with mayors, speaking at fundraisers, cutting ribbons at grand openings. She had even met him once, years ago, at a church event. And now, here he was, staring down the bank manager like he already knew exactly what was happening. The manager hesitated before finally forcing a tight smile. "No problem at all, Mr. Bennett. We're just following protocol." "Protocol?" Charles stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. He looked at Evelyn, then back at the manager. "Would you mind explaining exactly what that means in this case?" The manager squared her shoulders. "We have security measures in place for certain withdrawals, and we're simply requesting additional identification for $800, Charles cut in, his voice calm but sharp. The manager's lips parted slightly. It was clear she hadn't expected to be challenged so directly, at least not in front of an audience. Evelyn felt the energy in the room shift. Customers were listening now. Some were pretending not to, eyes darting between their phones and the scene unfolding in front of them. Others weren't even trying to be subtle about it. The man in khakis from earlier shuffled awkwardly. A woman in a blue sundress near the ATM glanced over, then nudged her husband. Even Brandon, the teller, looked like he wished he could disappear behind his monitor. Charles didn't break eye contact with the manager. "Tell me something," he said, voice still smooth, measured. "How long has Mrs. Daniels been banking here?" The manager hesitated. Evelyn answered for her. 30 years. Charles nodded. "And in those 30 years, how many times have you questioned her withdrawals like this?" Silence. The manager's jaw tightened, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Mr. Bennett, with all due respect—" "This isn't about respect," Charles interrupted, his voice still even. "This is about whether your policy is actually a policy, or if it's just being enforced selectively." That sentence landed. A ripple of awareness moved through the room. Someone in the back muttered something under their breath. The security guard near the entrance shifted uncomfortably. The manager inhaled, her expression unreadable. "As I said, we're just trying to prevent fraud." Charles exhaled through his nose, shaking his head slightly. "Fraud. Right." He turned back toward Evelyn. "Mrs. Daniels, have you ever committed fraud?" Evelyn let out a small, dry chuckle. "Not once in 78 years, no." The hint of amusement in her voice only made the moment heavier. Charles turned back to the manager. "And yet, she's the one being treated like a criminal in front of a room full of people." Evelyn felt something she couldn't quite name. Vindication, maybe, or just relief. But her face remained calm. She had spent her entire life navigating situations like this carefully. But Charles? He didn't have to. His presence alone was enough to make them rethink everything. The manager let out a slow breath. But before she could finish, an older man in a dark suit stepped forward from a nearby office. The branch director. "That's enough," he said, voice firm. He looked straight at the manager. "Process the withdrawal." The manager stiffened but nodded, swallowing whatever argument she had left. She turned toward Brandon. "Go ahead." Brandon's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard now, his previous hesitation completely gone. Evelyn let out a slow breath, watching as he counted out her cash. Bills she had been entitled to from the very beginning. But the damage had already been done. She turned slightly, taking in the expressions of those around her. The ones who had watched but said nothing. The ones who had looked away the moment things became uncomfortable. The ones who would have let this happen if Charles Bennett hadn't walked in. And that was the part that stung the most. She had spent her entire life being careful. Dressing a certain way, speaking a certain way, never making trouble. And still, here she was. As Brandon finally slid the cash toward her, Evelyn took it without a word. She didn't say thank you, because this wasn't a favor, but this wasn't over yet. Evelyn slid the cash into her purse, her fingers steady, her face unreadable. But inside? A storm brewed. She turned toward Charles Bennett, the man who had spoken up when no one else did. His expression was still firm, controlled, but there was something else in his eyes. Disapproval, maybe, or disappointment. Not in her, but in what had just happened. The bank manager, still stiff with discomfort, cleared her throat. "Mrs. Daniels, we appreciate your patience." Evelyn's gaze cut to her. "Do you?" The manager hesitated. Evelyn adjusted the strap of her purse. "Because from where I'm standing, it looked a whole lot like you assumed I was trying to steal my own money." A murmur rippled through the bank. The tension hadn't lifted. It had just changed shape. The manager opened her mouth, searching for the right words. Something to smooth things over. Something to make this moment go away. Charles folded his arms. "I'd like to know something," he said, looking directly at her. "Would you have asked me for 2 forms of ID if I had walked in here and requested the same withdrawal?" The manager didn't answer. The silence stretched. "You and I both know the answer," Charles continued, "and that's exactly the problem." His words landed like a hammer. A woman in line shifted, suddenly looking down at her phone. The man in khakis cleared his throat and adjusted his stance, as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. The security guard near the door averted his eyes. The branch director, the one who had overruled the manager just minutes ago, finally spoke. "This was a misjudgment," he said, his voice controlled but measured. "Mrs. Daniels, I sincerely apologize for the way this was handled." Evelyn studied him, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. And then she asked the question that had been sitting on her tongue from the moment this started. "How often does this happen to people like me when no one is around to speak up?" The director's face barely changed, but that moment of hesitation said enough. Charles let out a quiet breath. More often than they'd ever admit. Evelyn nodded, gripping the strap of her purse a little tighter. She had gotten her money. She had gotten her so-called apology. But something in her chest still felt heavy. Because she wasn't the only one who had been in this position before. And she wouldn't be the last. As she turned to leave, Charles stepped beside her. "Let me walk you out," he said quietly. Evelyn gave him a small, grateful nod, but she wasn't done just yet. Evelyn stepped toward the exit, Charles walking beside her. The moment they reached the door, she paused. Something inside her refused to let this end here. She turned back. The bank was too quiet now. Customers who had once been impatiently tapping their feet were suddenly glued to their spots, their interests split between pretending not to eavesdrop and not wanting to get involved. The manager, still standing behind the counter, looked relieved, probably thinking the worst was over. Evelyn wasn't about to let her off that easily. She straightened her back, adjusted the pearls around her neck and spoke, not just to the manager, but to everyone in that room. "You know, I've spent 78 years on this earth, and I learned a long time ago how folks like me get treated when people think no one is watching." No one moved. "But today you got caught." The manager stiffened. Charles tilted his head slightly, watching the moment unfold. Evelyn took a step forward, her voice steady. "I know what this was. You know what this was. And I need you to understand something. People remember when they're treated like they don't belong." She let the words settle, watching the manager's face, watching all of their faces. "You see, money spends the same no matter whose hands it's in," she continued, holding up her purse slightly. "But respect, that's something you don't get back once you lose it." The weight of her words lingered. A few people shifted, uncomfortable. One of the tellers, not Brandon but a young woman at the next counter, looked down at her hands, suddenly unable to meet Evelyn's gaze. The branch director, still standing off to the side, cleared his throat. "Mrs. Daniels, Again, I deeply apologize. I don't want your apology, Evelyn cut in, her voice still even. I want to know if you're going to do something about this. Silence. The director hesitated before responding. We will be reviewing our policies and procedures to ensure that... Evelyn let out a quiet breath. It wasn't a commitment. It was a line. A rehearsed, polished response meant to sound good in the moment, but be forgotten by morning. Charles spoke up beside her. I'll be checking back in a month, he said, his voice carrying through the room. And if I hear that anything like this happens again, we'll be having a very different conversation. The director's face didn't flinch, but something about the way he shifted his stance told Evelyn that he understood exactly what that meant. She gave one final look to the people in the room, the silent bystanders, the uncomfortable employees, the ones who would go home tonight and think about what they saw, but would never say a word about it. Then, finally, she turned back toward the door. Charles opened it for her, and as the two of them stepped into the Alabama heat, Evelyn exhaled, her chest a little lighter. But she wasn't just thinking about herself anymore. She was thinking about the next person who would walk through those doors and be treated the same way, and who would be there to speak up for them.